children know, oh my God, it's a lot of work. If half of them are going to die, you have a few extras, right? Are you following the logic here? I'm not kidding. That's actually the science behind it. So as birth rates go down, as child survival goes up. And antibiotics have been really instrumental in bringing child survival up in Western countries where antibiotics have been available. Even today, 2 doses a year of an antibiotic can cut death rates by as much as 25% in countries. So this is a new quote. Sometime last year I read this article in the New York Times where they were talking about, they were doing some experiments of just giving, so we say don't do this in this class. We say don't just randomly give kids antibiotics if they're not sick. But in places where infectious disease still kills a lot of children, giving children a dose of prophylactically of antibiotics a couple of times a year actually will potentially help bring birth rates down. So it's interesting that what's prescriptive here for your children isn't necessarily the right thing for children in sub-Saharan Africa who are malnourished and exposed to infectious agents. Fascinating stuff. Okay. Anyway, so the scourge of infection, it's really a different world now than it used to be. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you this video that I love. The guy's got kind of a funny voice. But this is on the discovery of penicillin. I may have to hold the little thingy-mabopper to make it sound work, but.
It is 1914. The European subcontinent is embroiled in bloody trench warfare. Soldiers on all sides are victims to artillery fire, mustard gas, and new automatic rifles. Their biggest enemy, however, is infection. Of those wounded in battle, few will survive even their minor injuries. Field hospitals populate the front lines, with young doctors and nurses working day and night to stem the stealthy killer. Their main defense is antiseptic, which proves just as lethal to the patients as no treatment at all. One frustrated young doctor called Alexander Fleming is unwilling to accept the inefficacy of current medicine to rescue the wounded in battle. He would later dedicate his life to understanding and fighting infections, going on to pioneer one of the most influential medical discoveries of the 20th century, a discovery which Time magazine claims has altered the course of history.
Fleming was born in Ayrshire, Scotland, to a farming family. He performed well at school, later moving to London to attend the Royal Polytechnic Institution, after which he took to working in a local shipping office. Fleming would work there for a subsequent 4 years, until receiving a fortuitous inheritance from his uncle that would see him through St. Mary's Hospital Medical School. It was this medical training which would later take Fleming to the front lines as a captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps, where he would gain first-hand knowledge of the perils of treating soldiers in battle. Before the outbreak of the First World War, Fleming had become assistant bacteriologist to Sir Almroth Wright, a pre-eminent scientist in the fields of bacteriology and immunology. His stay at the university was extended only at the insistence of the president of its rifling club, of which Fleming was a member. To remain active, Fleming took up the research position under Almroth in the immunology department. Unfortunately, Fleming's work was derailed when Britain joined the war effort on the 4th of August in 1914. By the conflict's close, Fleming had witnessed the need for a replacement to the ineffective and deadly antiseptics in use. Upon his return from the service, he resumed his position at St. Mary's, and with strong support from Wright, he dedicated much of his time to studying the effects of antiseptics and their unintended lethality in the war effort. A major breakthrough in his work came in the form of the discovery of lysozyme in human mucus. This naturally occurring agent protects the human immune system from certain common bacteria. By 1928, Fleming had been appointed professor of bacteriology at the University of London, leading research on common bacteria such as the staphylococci, which may be found on household surfaces. Ironically, it was the somewhat undesirable trait of Fleming's untidiness which would ultimately modernize the human effort against disease. Upon his return from a month-long holiday, Fleming found in his lab a petri dish upon which a fungus had grown. The dish contained a Staphylococcus culture, but around the mold growth, he found that all the bacteria had died off. His former assistant Merlin Price prompted Fleming to investigate the growth, reminding him of the lysozyme discovery. Of the occasion, Fleming later said,
When I woke up just after dawn on September 28, 1928, I certainly didn't plan to revolutionize all of medicine by discovering the world's first antibiotic or bacteria killer. But I suppose that was exactly what I did.
Modest.
within just a few short months, Fleming had managed to grow pure samples of the fungus and extracted a mold juice, which his experiments showed to kill off an array of various bacteria. Fleming understood then the significance of his discovery and shared it with the medical world. In convention with its genus, he named the agent penicillin.
All right, so that's Alexander Fleming and the discovery of penicillin. And I believe this is a picture of Fleming's plate here with the mold growing, and this is the staphylococci, and you can see that around where the mold was, the growth is much less prevalent. Sort of looks familiar based on the antibiotic labs that we did. So Fleming made this discovery. Again, they say he was kind of sloppy, so he had contamination on his plate, right? Sometimes the best discoveries in science are total accidents. In 1940, Florey and James performed the first clinical trial. So you can kind of see the timeline here. This is after World War I. This is just the beginning of World War II. In Europe, it's starting to rage, right? But in the U.S., I don't know what we got involved for a couple more years. By 1945, at the end of World War II, the three of them won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for the discovery of penicillin. And World War II was the first major application of antibiotics. So one of the major differences between World War I and World War II was the number of people who died of their wounds. In World War I, you saw very few injured soldiers come home because they got injured, they died. Like these are the wounds of infection. By World War II, we saw lots of men coming home injured with body parts missing, right? But they survived because penicillin was allowing them to fight the infection. So it really changed warfare in many ways. Humans survive much more horrific injuries now because of antibiotics than they would have in the past. It's also kind of interesting just the timeline in history where this got used, if you think about it. One of the reasons penicillin ramped up, the production of penicillin ramped up so quickly and got used so fast after its discovery. You'd never see this now. New drugs take 10 years and billions of dollars to get through clinical trials and get in use typically. But, within a couple of years, it's actually, 1940, the war's already happening in Europe. People are using penicillin because it's either that or die, right? And they ramped up very fast. So it was kind of an interesting time in history for many reasons, but certainly there was science is woven through history like everything else, and it's interesting to see how the production of antibiotics falls into this story. This is just a modern plate. Here's some Staph aureus, and here's a penicillium mold, and you can see that the mold is secreting chemicals that inhibit the growth of the staphylococcus, and that's exactly what Fleming found in his lab. So what are antibiotics? Because we tend to think that we developed them, but actually we didn't. They're just basically a form of chemical warfare between bacteria and between fungi and bacteria. So antibiotics are low molecular weight small molecules. Some of them have been synthesized by chemists. The sulfa antibiotics, those were actually discovered in a lab by chemists that were synthesizing molecules, but almost all of the microorganisms, all of the antibiotics that we use were first by microorganisms. So we've simply just isolated them and sort of taken their use for our own benefit. So microorganisms, it's just like us using chemical warfare against each other, right? But microorganisms basically put these chemicals out so they can survive and their competitors won't. Or so they can kill off their competitors before they're killed. So it's a defensive molecule that bacteria and molds produce. Cephalosporium and penicillium are two common molds, and the actinomycetes and streptomyces bacteria are commonly produce antibiotics, particularly, this is a subtype, but particularly streptomyces. And today, even now, for new antibiotics, people screen soil samples to look for fungi and bacteria and new molecules that might be beneficial. All right, so this is Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich was a scientist who was working on finding treatments for syphilis. And the treatments for syphilis at the time were pretty tough. You'd give people, I can't remember, but I think it was the silver solution, and that they were salvarsan, right, that they were taking, and it was pretty toxic. And they really wanted, Paul Ehrlich coined this term, a magic bullet. Something that you could take that would kill the bacteria that were causing the infection, but not harm you. And it comes from a folk tale about a magic bullet, where if you shot the bullet, you wouldn't have to aim at the person you were trying to hit, that it would just, the mallet was magic, it would weave around and hit your target. You following the idea here? Yeah? Is there a movie?
The Wanted?
The Wanted? There's a movie
No,
about
Wanted. With Angelina Jolie.
this? And they used
They turned the bullet.
it
It's
was a
dumb.
stupid movie. I have a little clip, though, that I could insert into my lecture here. Do they? Who's gonna find that clip and send it to me? Okay, good job. Because I'll forget, but that would be awesome to put that here, right? All right, so think that we should make it better for the next semester. We'll help you. All right, so the idea of the magic bullet, this is an old kind of, folklore thing, this idea of a magic bullet, but this was the analogy that Paul Ehrlich came up with. That they could find a chemical, a drug that you could take that would leave all of your cells alone but only hurt the bacteria. And that's exactly what antibiotics do. The best antibiotics have little or no toxic effect on the animal that's taking the drug. Normally, if you take penicillin, most of you probably are not allergic to it, because that's a different story. But if you're not allergic to penicillin and you take it, you probably don't notice that you've even taken anything. It has just really no effect on you. Maybe it gives you a little diarrhea because the microbes in your gut are affected. But for the most part, you feel nothing, but it really will completely take down the bacteria that are in your body. And this is because it takes advantage of the differences between animal cells and bacterial cells. So we're going to talk more about the mechanism of how antibiotics work in just a moment. But just thinking about the sort of the timeline, so in 1929, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. In 1935, I mentioned that sulfonamides were first discovered in a lab. And then World War II happened, and there was a massive drive of research for antibiotics because they had all these war veterans or injured soldiers who they wanted to try to treat. So this made things happen very quickly. By the 1950s, we had several antibiotics in clinical use. Whoops. Okay. The path to providing antibiotics to people wasn't necessarily a smooth one. There are a lot of rules now about drugs. We have the Food and Drug Administration that doesn't work for supplements, but certainly for drugs that get prescribed, they actually check to make sure that drugs are safe and effective before companies are allowed to sell them. But prior to that, it was a wild, wild west of medicine. So let me show you this video just to horrify you a little more.
The history of medicine is full of some huge triumphs, but also some pretty terrible mistakes. Like in the 1930s, a company out to make a quick buck took a safe, effective drug and managed to make it a killer. But surrounding that tragedy are some pretty fascinating stories. How a dye became a wonder drug, how the US FDA became what it is today, and how one scientist walked home with a Nobel Prize. The drug in question is called elixir sulfanilamide, and it was briefly manufactured and sold by the S.E. Massengill Company of Tennessee in 1937. But before this deadly elixir was concocted, sulfanilamide had a good rep as an effective drug all on its own. Sulfanilamide is an antibiotic, so it's used to fight bacterial infections. It works by interfering with bacteria's ability to make folic acid, which they need to reproduce. It was derived from an earlier drug called Prontosil, which had a vivid red color and was actually developed by the dye industry. In 1932, chemist Gerhard Domach found that this molecule wasn't just pretty. It could cure bacterial infections in mice. And once Prontosil hit the market in 1935, it quickly gained popularity and saved a lot of lives. In fact, Prontosil and related compounds were some of the earliest widespread antibiotics. Penicillin had already been discovered, but it wasn't easily available yet. Further research showed that there were two parts to the Prontosil molecule. One part was the dye, and the other was the antibiotic. The antibiotic half was sulfanilamide, which researchers found could be used on its own, mostly in powder or pill form. While it had potential side effects, it was generally safe. We actually still use sulfanilamide to treat vaginal infections, though not very often because there are other antimicrobials out there nowadays. The problem was that sulfanilamide had already been synthesized by chemists and the patent had expired. So anybody could make and sell variants of it. Enter the Massengill Company, who found that their customers liked their drugs in syrup form. They set out to make a liquid version of sulfanilamide, and their researchers eventually found that the powder would dissolve in diethylene glycol. At the time, diethylene glycol was known as a solvent. It had a sweet taste and smell, and once the lab added some caramel and raspberry flavoring, they figured they had a nice medicine and released it as an antibiotic elixir. Frankly, it sounds tastier than some of the cough syrups I've had, except for one thing. Diethylene glycol is super poisonous. Back then, there were 1 or 2 scientific studies about its toxicity, but they weren't widely known. These days, it's used as antifreeze, among other things, and we know it's not a sweet treat. Inside your body, diethylene glycol takes time to do its dirty work. At first, the symptoms resemble drunkenness, but after several hours, the poisoning gets worse. While scientists aren't exactly sure how it kills, we do know it gets broken down by your liver into a nastier form. From there, it shuts down the kidneys and can affect the nervous system too. The instructions that shipped with the deadly elixir sulfanilamide said to keep giving it to patients until they got better, which means that some people were poisoned by well-meaning loved ones who fed them antifreeze for days or weeks until they succumbed, usually from kidney failure. In total, at least 105 people died. And if Massengill had just fed it to a handful of mice before shipping a bunch of it out, this tragedy might have been prevented. Before 1938, the US FDA only had the power to prevent adulteration and mislabel. You couldn't, for example, sell tablets of flour and say it was medicine. That was against the law. But you could sell something that was poison with zero safety testing beforehand, as long as it was what you said on the label. The Massengill Company's elixir contained exactly what they said it did: sulfanilamide and diethylene glycol, with some water and flavor. But they did technically break the law. They called the stuff an elixir. But that word was only supposed to be used for products that contained ethyl alcohol, and Massengill syrup had none. The FDA seized on this technicality. They used it to track down the tainted medicine and slapped Massengill with an unprecedented fine. If not for the fine print, they would have been helpless and many more people could have died. But a new law was rushed through Congress in 1938, giving the FDA increased power over drug safety. That law is credited with preventing the infamous drug thalidomide, which was found to cause severe birth defects, from hitting the US shelves many years later. In the aftermath of this tragedy and new legislation, the chemist responsible for the antifreeze elixir committed suicide. And the senator who sponsored the 1938 drug law died shortly after it passed, reportedly of exhaustion. Powder and pill forms of sulfanilamide were still being made in labs and widely used as antibiotics by American soldiers in World War II. As for Gerhard Domach, developer of Prontosil, he won the 1939 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for helping to usher in the antibiotic era. Because really, Prontosil, sulfanilamide, and related compounds were used a lot at the time and can be safe and effective antibiotics. You know, as long as you don't take them with antifreeze. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow. If you want to learn more about health-related science and policy, you can check out videos with Dr. Aaron Carroll.
So this is really, I mean, that's a quick story. There's really a lot in there. And I just want to kind of highlight one thing. So basically, the people who died from this, because that happened and Congress was able to pass a law, you know, we still have trouble with regulations today, right? Or no, deregulated. But this is what, you know, regulations got developed for reasons, and usually it's because people died, and so we decided we needed to regulate stuff. Fairly soon after this, they started giving thalidomide in Europe to women who were pregnant because it's a great anti-nausea medicine. And there was one woman who worked for the FDA, and because of this law, she blocked the sale of thalidomide in the US. She felt like the safety studies showed that it might be unsafe. And she blocked it and blocked it and blocked it, and she was being fought hard by multi-million, billions were big dollars then, but you know, multi-million-dollar pharmaceutical companies who really wanted to get this product in the market and get lots of pregnant women taking it. And to her credit, she managed to block it long enough that it didn't get sold in the US. And so we know in Europe that thalidomide interferes, if you take it at the time when the baby is developing arms and legs, it interferes with the development of arms and legs. So a whole bunch of children were born in Europe without arms and legs. And she blocked it long enough to prevent that from happening here. But you have to understand what she was up against to block that. And she used the law that Congress created because of the elixir, the sulfonamide elixir, to prevent that from happening. Anyway, a woman scientist at the FDA in the 1940s managed to prevent big pharmaceutical companies from pushing that drug out. That was pretty impressive. I don't remember her name. Toot her horn, though, because she's pretty heroic in my book. Questions?
Oh, that was gonna be I was just gonna ask what her name was.
I can look it up for you. I should know because I think she was really amazing. If for no other reason that she stood up to a whole bunch. She was like the only woman, and she was getting a lot of pressure from both her bosses at the FDA and these pharmaceutical companies, and she really stood her ground. And there are people who have arms and legs today. Yeah.
Eat the rich.
Other questions? Sometimes doing the right thing is really hard. And you end up being really unpopular while you're doing it.
Francis Oldham Kelsey.
Francis Oldham, Kelsey? Okay. It's a great story after the fact. She died a few years ago, as I recall. Does it say when her death was? I think it was just
2015.
2015, yeah. So it was recent. Okay, well, let's do some hard work. Some interesting stories around all this science that we're talking about. Some terms that you're going to want to know as you go into healthcare fields are broad and narrow spectrum antibiotics. So a narrow spectrum antibiotic has a limited amount of activity. It kills usually just a certain type of bacteria, whereas a broad spectrum antibacterial tends to kill lots of different bacteria. So what they're trying to show here is a broad spectrum that kills all sorts of different bacteria versus a narrow spectrum that kills just one type. The first narrow spectrum antibiotics were things like penicillin. Penicillin G, which is the first form that was discovered, had to be injected. That one only killed gram-positive bacteria. So here is penicillin G. There's another very, very narrow, narrow spectrum. It only kills gram-positives. Another narrow spectrum antibiotic is a drug called isoniazid that kills bacteria that have a mycolic acid cell wall, like the bacterium that causes tuberculosis, Mycobacteria tuberculosis. So this is a very narrow spectrum. I frequently have students that are taking isoniazid and rifampin for TB because if you have a positive skin test, sometimes they just give you those drugs and say take them for 6 months. So this is the drug that oftentimes after I give this lecture, I'll have a student come up to me and show me their isoniazid pills at the end of class. Here's a more broad spectrum. So streptomycin is effective against gram-negative and Mycobacterium tetracycline, very broad spectrum, covering the gram-positive and the gram-negative organisms. So depending on how many different kinds of organisms are killed, we say it's broad or narrow spectrum. All right, then another term you need to know is side versus static. And this one's easy to remember because if you can remember the word homicide, do you live after homicide? No, it kills you. So side means death and static means that you just basically stop growth. So there are some bacteria that actually just prevent the bacteria from continuing to grow. So you can see they've got little ropes wrapped around them. They're still alive, but they've been tied up so they can't do anything, right? And then you have antibiotics that kill bacteria, and so these guys are all dead. So those are bactericidal versus bacteriostatic antibiotics. Okay, so those are two different categories that people refer to. Oh, look, a quicker question. All right, a researcher invented a new antibiotic that was effective against almost every type of bacteria she tested. The antibiotic would be classified as...
Excuse me. Excuse me.
Everything okay?
That one is good.
Oh, it's not ready? Okay. All right, last chances to click in. All right. Whoops. All right, so you guys are correctly saying that that is a broad spectrum antibiotic. Broad spectrum. All right, what about this question? So now she treated the bacterial culture with the new antibiotic. The researcher found that she could still grow the bacteria simply by removing the drug. This means her antibiotic is probably which of the following? All right, last chance to click in. All right, good. So those questions were easy for you guys. You got them correct. So that's a bacteriostatic. The bacteria weren't killed, they were just prevented from growing. There are a lot of antibiotics out there. And, one option, I guess, would be that we memorize all of them. I don't think that's a good use of your time. You're going to memorize the important ones in nursing school. I'll let your nursing teachers be better at this. But I do want you to know the mechanisms of how antibiotics work, so that when you go to nursing school and they have you learn about tetracycline and they say that's a protein synthesis inhibitor, you know what they mean. Or they say penicillin is a cell wall inhibitor, that you know what that means. Okay? So you're going to have to know about penicillin because it's famous and how it works. We've already talked about how sulfonylamides work, because we talked about that when we talked about competitive inhibition in enzymes. And then, tetracycline is a really good example of a protein synthesis inhibitor. So we've got a few that we'll know, but for the most part, what I really want you to know are the 5 mechanisms, the 5 different ways that antibiotics work. And we started with this in the lab. Remember how I had them divided by mechanism in the little boxes for you? Okay, so today we're just going to reinforce what we learned then. There are 5 different mechanisms. So there are bacteria that inhibit the cell wall. Do you have cell walls? You have cell walls?
No.
No, you have cell membranes, right? Bacteria have cell walls. And that's awesome, because that means that we can give you bacteria these medicines that prevent them from making cell walls, and your cells don't care at all, because you don't make cell walls. They don't make you sick at all. They only hurt the bacteria. Does that make sense? So basically, the way antibiotic mechanisms work is they take advantage of the differences between your cells and bacterial cells. They do things that hurt bacteria that can't hurt you because your cells are different. Okay, so you don't have a cell wall, so antibiotics that block the production of cell walls are ones that are toxic to bacteria but don't hurt you. So the penicillin, cephalosporins, carbapenems, vancomycin, bacitracin, this one I don't know, fosfomycin, I don't know about that one. Isoniazid is the one that we said was effective against the, not gram-positive or gram-negative, but the acid-fast bacteria, ones that have glycolic acid. All right, another thing that's different about you and bacteria is your ribosomes. Remember we said that you have ADS ribosomes, but bacteria only have 70S ribosomes. They're a little bit smaller. Yes? Remember how we had to learn all this and you thought, why am I learning this? This is why. Because it helps when we get to this part. All right, so because you have ADS ribosomes, we can give bacteria drugs that interfere with their ribosomes and their protein synthesis but don't hurt yours. And so these are drugs like erythromycin, clindamycin, I'm trying to think of the ones that are really common, gentamicin, streptomycin, tetracycline, those are all ones you've probably heard of. So those either mess with the 50S subunit or mess with the 30S subunit. Some of them actually prevent the mRNA from binding to the 30S subunit. The macrolides, I say they make the ribosome constipated. They prevent the protein from being able to get out the ribosome as it's being produced. All right, so that's one mechanism, cell wall inhibitors. Another mechanism is protein synthesis inhibitors. There are also bacteria, the sulfonylamides, prevent the synthesis of folic acid, which is necessary for bacteria to make DNA and RNA. There are antibiotics that inhibit replication and transcription, so things that inhibit enzymes in DNA replication like gyrase. And then a drug called rifampin or rifamycin that inhibits RNA polymerase. So those are very specific to nucleic acid synthesis. And then the last category is cytoplasmic membrane inhibitors, and these actually don't really inhibit the membrane so much as they just sort of punch holes in it and it loses permeability. Right? We tend to use these more, I believe, on skin, on the surface of skin. Some of these are toxic to humans, and we tend to use them on the skins and on the surface of skin instead of take them orally. All right, so there's our list of 5: protein synthesis, cell wall, cytoplasmic membrane, DNA and RNA, and then folic acid, or this. The other way we refer to this is blocking metabolism. They block the metabolic pathway in the cell. All right, so we're going to go through these one by one, spending the most amount of time on the cell wall inhibitors, because I want you to know a little bit more about them. The way most of these work, not all of them, but most of them work by preventing cross-linking of peptidoglycan in the bacterial cell wall. If you have forgotten about our lecture on prokaryotic cell structure, you might want to go back and just review that bacteria have, we said the gram-positive have a thick layer of peptidoglycan and gram-negative have a thin layer of peptidoglycan. But both cell types need their peptidoglycan. All right, and if you disrupt that, it's actually bactericidal. It kills them because the cell wall gets weak and ruptures, and the insides of the bacteria escape, and it's a gruesome sight for your bacteria. So the cell wall becomes greatly weakened. This only affects actively growing cells, so only if the cells are actually making peptidoglycan does this affect them. And only cells with peptidoglycan are affected, so you couldn't use one of these drugs, for example, on a bacteria that doesn't have peptidoglycan, and there are a few. So here's some pictures, if you like violent pictures. Right, here you go. Here's a healthy, happy bacterium, and then it gets given penicillin, and it looks like someone has blown it up. Right? I always think this would be a great class for like teenage boys. So wait till we get to the immune system. A lot of death and destruction by your immune system. Okay, so these are the penicillins, and so this is called a beta-lactam ring. You see this little yellow structure here? The four-member ring. It's got a nitrogen and then 3 carbons. Beta-lactam ring. Remember beta-lactamase was the enzyme that destroyed ampicillin in the Vigo lab? Lactamase, so it breaks down lactam rings, so it breaks down the beta-lactam ring. This is what was discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928. And this was great, except for you had to inject it, which no one likes. Very few people like. So scientists worked pretty quickly to figure out a way to modify this molecule in order to take it orally. So they actually made a few structural changes to it. There's some change here. Let me see if there's anything else. That looks like about it, huh? And this actually can be taken orally. So this, if you take it, it doesn't get destroyed by your stomach acids. It gets into your circulation. So this is penicillin B. Quickly, the people took the bacteria, basically the bacteria made this. And quickly the scientists took that basic structure into the lab and started making all these other antibiotics, many of them based on having this beta-lactam ring, and then this is a common major structure here, the common nucleus is not just the ring, but these other parts. So we have oxacillin and ampicillin. One of the nice things about ampicillin was that it was an extended spectrum, whereas this particular antibiotic was really only killed gram-positive bacteria. By modifying it to ampicillin, now it actually killed gram-positive and gram-negative. When I was growing up, it was the golden age of give kids lots of antibiotics all the time. If they have a sore throat, give them antibiotics. You know, if their ears hurt at all, just give them antibiotics. We always had a bottle of pink medicine in the fridge that had antibiotics in them, and my mom was always giving one of us antibiotics. And of course, now that would be malpractice, but at the time, you know, that was the standard of care. And it was almost always ampicillin because they figured, why just kill one? Just kill them all, right? To make sure we get them all. Of course, now it's much more beneficial. If you have a narrow spectrum, you would always give someone narrow spectrum because we know you've got all these really beneficial microbes in your gut. And why kill them and upset your stomach more if you can just target the ones that are causing the infection? So now we look for narrow spectrum. That's a benefit. At the time, broad spectrum seemed like an advantage. So just goes to show you in a very short number of years how much we learned. I don't know if you guys are chronic email checkers like me, but I sent out as I was driving in this morning, I was listening to NPR, and they had bacterial baptism story. Have you guys seen that? I sent it out as an announcement. And you want to click into Canvas because when I send it out and it goes to your email, it loses the embedded link. So just go into announcements and click on it, and you can just play it right from